Welcome back to our class on epistemology and the search for truth. This week's lesson is epistemology and the nature of propositional knowledge. So as we learned last week, epistemology is the study of knowledge. Epistemologists concern themselves with a number of tasks which we might sort into two different categories, the first of which we'll look at this week, the second of which we'll look at next week. So the first, we must determine the nature of knowledge. That is, what does it mean to say that someone knows or fails to know something? This is a matter of understanding what knowledge is and how to distinguish between cases in which someone knows something and cases in which someone does not know something. While there is some general agreement about some aspects of this issue, we shall see that this question is much more difficult than we might imagine. Second, we must determine the extent of human knowledge. That is, how much do we or can we know? We'll look at that next week. How can we use our reason, our senses, the testimony of others, experts, and other resources to acquire knowledge? Are there limits to what we can know? For instance, are some things unknowable? Is it possible that we do not know nearly as much as we think we do? Should we have a legitimate worry about skepticism, the view that we do not or cannot know anything at all? There's some fun discussions there. That's next week. While this class and the following will provide an overview of the important issues, it'll leave some of the most basic questions unanswered. Epistemology will continue to be an area of philosophical discussion as long as these questions remain. So today we're going to talk about the first category and discuss propositional truth and the justification of beliefs. This will be a lot, so I recommend at times just hitting the pause button on your phone or computer and just letting concepts sink in for a moment. So first, we're going to talk about kinds of knowledge. So kinds of knowledge. The term epistemology comes from the Greek episteme, meaning knowledge, and logos, meaning roughly study or science of. Logos is the root of all terms ending in ology, such as psychology, anthropology, zoology, and of logic, and has many other related meanings. In John's Gospel, Jesus is called the Word of God. The Greek word used is logos, means study, reason, knowledge, all of those things combined. Now, the word knowledge and its cognates are used in a variety of ways. One common use of the word know is an expression of psychological conviction. For instance, we might hear someone say, "I just knew it wouldn't rain, but then it did." While this may be an appropriate usage, philosophers tend to use the word know in a factive sense, so that one cannot know something that is not the case. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes. Even if we restrict ourselves to factive usages, there are still multiple senses of knowledge, and so we need to distinguish between them. One kind of knowledge is procedural knowledge, sometimes called competence or know-how. For example, one can know how to ride a bicycle, or one can know how to drive from Washington, D.C. to New York. Another kind of knowledge is acquaintance knowledge or familiarity. For instance, one can know the mayor, or one can know the Hershey Company, or know Philadelphia. Epistemologists typically do not focus on procedural or acquaintance knowledge, however, instead preferring to focus on propositional knowledge. A proposition is something which can be expressed by a declarative statement, and which purports to describe a fact or a state of affairs, such as dogs are mammals. 2 + 2 = 7. It is wrong to murder innocent people for fun. Now note that a proposition may be true or false. That is, it need not actually express a fact because 2 + 2 does not equal 7, but the statement is still a proposition. Propositional knowledge, then, can be called knowledge that statements of propositional knowledge or the lack thereof are properly expressed using that clauses, such as he knows that Houston is in Texas, or she does not know that the square root of 81 is 9. Knowledge that. So today we're going to focus on propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge obviously encompasses knowledge about a wide range of matters: scientific knowledge, geographical knowledge, mathematical knowledge, self-knowledge, and knowledge about any field of study whatsoever. Any truth might, in principle, be knowable, although there might be unknowable truths, another larger philosophical discussion. One goal of epistemology is to determine the criteria for knowledge so that we can know what can or cannot be known. In other words, the study of epistemology fundamentally includes the study of meta-epistemology, what we can know about knowledge itself. Isn't that fun? We can also distinguish between different types of propositional knowledge based on the source of the knowledge, how we get that knowledge. So, non-empirical or a priori knowledge is possible independently of or prior to any experience and requires only the use of reason. So a priori, fancy Greek stuff, before, prior to experience. Examples include knowledge of logical truths, such as the law of non-contradiction, as well as knowledge of abstract claims, such as ethical claims, or claims about various conceptual matters. You don't have an empirical experience that you've tasted, touched, seen. So it's a priori, before you actually have the experience. There are some knowledge that we can have a priori. Empirical or a posteriori knowledge is possible only subsequent or posterior to certain sense experiences, in addition to the use of reason. Examples include knowledge of the color or shape of a physical object, or knowledge of geographical locations. Some philosophers, called rationalists, believe that all knowledge is ultimately grounded upon reason. Others, called empiricists, believe that all knowledge is ultimately grounded upon experience. So you got more empiricists coming out of the Enlightenment, especially after people like Immanuel Kant, in a book called The Critique of Pure Reason, really tried to argue that you can only know something if you can experience it. All knowledge had to basically be a posteriori knowledge. Now, my favorite theologian, and hopefully yours, Karl Bart, revolutionized theology after Kant by moving from a classical theology that was largely based on a priori knowledge about God, such as assumptions about the nature of God, omniscience, all-powerful, based on reasoned deductions, but not based on any kind of experience. He moved it to one based in a posteriori knowledge of God. I hope to talk more about that in the future by talking about how epistemology can affect theology, especially when looking at Christology, which is the study of the person and work of Christ. That's a lot of ologies in one lesson. It'll be fun. Now, a thorough epistemology should, of course, address all kinds of knowledge, although there might be different standards for a priori and a posteriori knowledge. We can also distinguish between individual knowledge and collective knowledge. Social epistemology is the subfield of epistemology that addresses the way that groups, institutions, or other collective bodies might come to acquire knowledge. So let's talk about the nature of propositional knowledge. Having narrowed our focus to propositional knowledge, we must ask ourselves what exactly constitutes knowledge. What does it mean for someone to know something? What is the difference between someone who knows something and someone who does not know it, or between someone who knows something and one who does not know? Since the scope of knowledge is so broad, we need a general characterization of knowledge, one which is applied to any kind of proposition whatsoever. Epistemologists have usually undertaken this task by seeking a correct and complete analysis of the concept of knowledge. In other words, a set of individual, necessary, and jointly sufficient conditions which determines whether someone knows something. In basic terms, they want to have a set of criteria that if all of these are met, you know for sure this person knows something. That seems like that should be easy, but it's not. So let's talk about belief. Let's begin with the observation that knowledge is a mental state. That is, knowledge exists in one's mind, and unthinking things cannot know anything, like a rock. Not the rock Dwayne Johnson, but a rock. A rock can't know something that we know of anyway. That's a question in itself. How can we know a rock doesn't know something? That's interesting. Further, knowledge is a specific kind of mental state. While that clauses can also be used to describe desires and intentions, these cannot constitute knowledge. Rather, knowledge is a kind of belief. If one has no beliefs about a particular matter, one cannot have knowledge about it. For instance, suppose that you desire to be given a raise in salary, and that you intend to do whatever you can to earn one. Suppose further that you are doubtful as to whether you will indeed be given a raise due to the intricacies of the company's budget and all that stuff. Given that you do not believe that you will be given a raise, you cannot be said to know that you will. Only if you are inclined to believe something can you come to know it. Similarly, thoughts that an individual has never entertained are not among their beliefs and thus cannot be included in their body of knowledge. Now, some beliefs, those which the individual is actively entertaining, are called occurrent beliefs. The majority of an individual's beliefs are non-occurrent. These are beliefs that the individual has in the background, but is not entertaining at a particular time. Think about your computer. You often have a lot of different apps and programs running, but you might only be on Microsoft Word at the moment. That doesn't mean that the clock or an internet browser isn't open and actively working in that moment. So correspondingly, most of our knowledge is non-occurrent or background knowledge. Only a small amount of one's knowledge is ever actively on one's mind. Okay, so let's talk about truth. Knowledge then requires belief. Of course, not all beliefs constitute knowledge. Belief is necessary, but not sufficient for knowledge. We are all sometimes mistaken in what we believe. In other words, while some of our beliefs are true, others are false. As we try to acquire knowledge, then, we are trying to increase our stock of true beliefs while simultaneously minimizing our false beliefs. In a few weeks, I'll do a class specifically on facts and opinions being a form of belief, and how both are important and both may be true, but also both can be not true. That'll be a fun one to talk about too. Now, we might say that the most typical purpose of beliefs is to describe or capture the way things actually are. That is, when one forms a belief, one is seeking a match between one's mind and the world. We sometimes, of course, form beliefs for other reasons, to create a positive attitude, to deceive ourselves, and so forth. But when we seek knowledge, we are trying to get things right, or we should be. And alas, we sometimes fail to achieve such a match. Some of our beliefs do not describe the way things actually are. Sometimes we'll never know for sure. I believe certain things about God. I want to be as correct and truthful as possible, but a lot of them, there's no way I'm going to absolutely 100% know until maybe heaven. And even then, I'm probably not going to fully know them in 100% certainty and clarity, because God is so much bigger than I am. A finite mind cannot fully comprehend an infinite thing. Now, note that we are assuming here that there is such a thing as objective truth, so that it is possible for beliefs to match or fail to match with reality. That is, in order for someone to know something, there must be something one knows about. Recall that we are discussing knowledge in the factive sense. If there are no facts of the matter, there's nothing to know, or fail to know. This assumption, though, is not universally accepted. In particular, is not shared by some proponents of relativism, but it will not be defended here. If you want to go learn about relativism, Google it. However, we can say that truth is a condition of knowledge. That is, if a belief is not true, it cannot constitute knowledge. Accordingly, if there's no such thing as truths, as some postmodern philosophers propose, then there can be no real knowledge. And there are some who argue that. We may talk about that in the future, but for now, let's assume that truth exists and it is knowable. Even if there is such a thing as truth, if there is a domain in which there are no truths, then there can be no knowledge within that domain. For example, if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then a belief that something is beautiful cannot be true or false, and thus cannot constitute knowledge. Does that make sense? So we want to basically go, for our purposes now, we are going to assume that there are truths and that they can be known. Okay, so here's where it gets fun. We're going to talk about justification. Now, lots of different ologies have justification. There's a whole branch of theology about justification. That's a whole different thing. We're going to talk about it in the epistemological sense. Knowledge requires factual belief. However, this does not suffice to capture the nature of knowledge. Just as knowledge requires successfully achieving the object of true belief, it also requires success with regard to the formation of that belief. In other words, it's not enough just to have a true belief, one that is right. How you came to that belief also helps, and it determines whether you actually have knowledge or not. Because you might have just gotten lucky that you happen to have a right belief, but just because you're lucky that a belief is right, is it actually knowledge? Knowledge is both having the right belief, but also having the right process to attain that belief. In other words, not all true beliefs constitute knowledge. Only true beliefs arrived at in the right way constitute knowledge. So who gets to decide what the right way is? What then is the right way of arriving at beliefs? In addition to truth, what other properties must a belief have in order to constitute knowledge? This is what philosophy is all about. We might begin by noting that sound reason and solid evidence seem to be the way to acquire knowledge. By contrast, a lucky guess cannot constitute knowledge. For instance, I passed my AP chemistry exam by pure luck. I cannot be said to have knowledge of chemistry, and yet I didn't have to take chemistry in college because the way the test was didn't actually test my knowledge. Because I literally randomly bubbled on that AP test, and on the short answer questions, I drew a giant smiley face and said, please give me 3 AP readers so I don't have to take this in college. And somehow I got a 3. That was pure luck. I have no knowledge of chemistry. The test did not do a good job testing my knowledge. It did a good job testing my luck in randomly bubbling. So, a lucky guess does not constitute knowledge. Similarly, misinformation and faulty reasoning do not seem like a recipe for knowledge, even if they happen to lead to a true belief. In future lessons, we'll talk more about critical thinking and argumentation and the process of reasoning. See, you have so much to look forward to. Now, a belief is said to be justified if it is obtained in the right way. You're justified in a belief if you have good reason to have that belief. While justification seems at first glance to be a matter of a belief being based on evidence and reasoning rather than on luck or misinformation, we're going to see there's much disagreement regarding how to spell out the details. The requirement that knowledge involves justification does not necessarily mean that knowledge requires absolute certainty, however. I always say I'm never absolutely certain about almost anything because I'm always partially wrong and never fully right. Humans are fallible beings, and there's a whole branch of philosophy called fallibilism, and that's the view that it is possible to have knowledge even when one's true beliefs might have turned out to be false. Now, between beliefs which were necessarily true and those which are true solely by luck, like my AP chemistry exam, lies a spectrum of beliefs with regard to which we had some defeasible reason to believe that they would be true. There's a big spectrum between belief by luck and things that we might feel we're certain about with all kinds of evidence. For instance, I heard the weatherman say that there's a 90% chance of rain, and as a result, I formed the belief that it would rain. Then my true belief that it would rain was not true purely by luck. I had good reason to believe that. Even though there was some chance, 10%, that my belief might have been false, there was a sufficient basis for that belief for it to constitute knowledge. I could tell others, I have knowledge that there's a 90% chance it's going to rain today. This basis is referred to as the justification for that belief. We can then say that to constitute knowledge, a belief must both be true and justified. So it didn't rain. I had the true belief that it didn't rain, and I had the justified reason, because an expert, a weatherman, said 90% chance it wouldn't rain. There was still that small chance it would rain, but I was justified in my belief it wouldn't rain, and it turned out I was right, it did not rain. Now, note that because of luck, a belief can be unjustified, yet true. Because somebody else could have said, oh, it's definitely going to rain, just because I feel it in my bones. They'd have no real evidence for that, but by luck, maybe that 10% it did rain. Then they would have had a true belief, yet not necessarily justified. And because of human fallibility, a belief can be justified and yet false. In other words, truth and justification are two independent conditions of belief. The fact that a belief is true does not tell us whether or not it is justified. That depends on how the belief was arrived at. Are you with me? So two people might hold the same true belief about whether it's going to rain or not, but for different reasons, so that one of them is justified and the other is unjustified. One might have looked at all kinds of weather reports to believe it's not going to rain. Another might have just said, you know what, I don't want it to rain, so I believe it's not going to rain. One is justified, the other is not, but both beliefs turn out to be true. Similarly, the fact that a belief is justified does not tell us whether it's true or false. Of course, a justified belief will presumably be more likely to be true than to be false, and justified beliefs will presumably be more likely or more probable to be true than unjustified beliefs. But it doesn't match 100% of the time. You can have a justified belief and yet still be wrong. So now that we've talked about what a justified true belief is, one that is justified because you have reason to believe it and it ends up being true, so you have a justified true belief. Now I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into all of that by talking about the Gettier problem. So for some time, the justified true belief JTB account was widely agreed to capture the nature of knowledge. The JTB theory of knowledge is an attempt to provide a set of necessary and sufficient conditions under which a person can be said to know something. The theory suggests that if a person, call him Andy, has a belief, say B, if B is in fact true, and if Andy is justified in believing B, then Andy knows that B. Makes sense. If you have good reason to believe it, and it turns out to be true, you have a justified true belief, you have knowledge. However, in 1963, Edmund Gettier published a short but widely influential article which has shaped much subsequent work in epistemology. Gettier provided two examples in which someone had a true and justified belief, but in which we seem to want to deny that that individual has knowledge because luck or chance still seems to play a role in his belief having turned out to be true. So consider an example. Suppose that the clock in your house, which keeps accurate time and is well maintained, stopped working for some unknown reason at exactly 11:56 p.m. last night. It is yet to be repaired. You don't know it stopped working. The next morning you wake up and you go about your day and happen to glance at your clock as you're about to make lunch exactly 12 hours after the clock stopped. You glance at the clock and form the belief that the time is 11:56 p.m. Your belief is true, of course, since the time is indeed 11:56 because it's exactly 12 hours after the clock stopped. And your belief is justified as you have no reason to doubt that the clock is working. It's always worked in the past. And you cannot be blamed for basing beliefs about the time on what your clock says. Nonetheless, it seems evident that you do not actually know that the time is 11:56. You may think you know it, but you don't. It's all just chance. After all, if you had walked past the clock a bit earlier or a bit later, you would have ended up with a false belief rather than a true one. Does that make sense? So this example and others like it, while perhaps somewhat far-fetched, seem to show that it is possible for justified true belief to fail to constitute knowledge. To put it another way, the justification condition was meant to ensure that knowledge was based on solid evidence and reason rather than just on luck and misinformation. But Gettier-type examples seem to show that justified true belief can still involve luck and chance and thus still fall short of knowledge. This problem is referred to as the Gettier problem. So to solve this problem, we must either show that all instances of justified true belief do indeed constitute knowledge, or alternatively, refine our analysis of knowledge. So let's talk about the no false belief condition. We might think that there is a simple and straightforward solution to the Gettier problem. Note that my reasoning was tacitly based on your belief that your clock is working properly, and that this belief turned out to be false. Yet due to history and experience, you had no reason to doubt your belief about the clock's good order. This seems to explain what has gone wrong in this example. Accordingly, we might revise our analysis of knowledge by insisting that to constitute knowledge, a belief must be true and justified and must be formed without relying on any false beliefs. In other words, we might say justification, truth, and belief are all necessary for knowledge, but they are not jointly sufficient for knowledge. There is a fourth condition, namely that no false beliefs be essentially involved in the reasoning that led to the belief, which is also necessary. Now, it's difficult because sometimes you don't realize you're depending on a false belief, but you may learn it later. So it adds a fourth condition to be met for someone to have knowledge. Now, false beliefs can be quite common even if they are justified. For example, for many years, scientists thought that protons, electrons, and neutrons were the smallest particles. They had a justified belief based on research, but later research proved that their belief was false. So for a long time, they thought they had knowledge, but they didn't. Unfortunately, though, this will not suffice. We can modify the example so that my belief is justified and true and is not based on any false belief but still falls short of knowledge. Suppose, for instance, that you do not have any beliefs about the clock's current state, but merely the more general belief that the clock usually is in working order. This belief, which is true, would suffice to justify my belief or your belief that the time is now 11:56. Of course, it still seems evident that you do not actually know the time. So we'll talk about the no defeaters condition. So the no false belief condition does not seem to be completely misguided. Perhaps we can add some other condition to justification and truth to yield a correct characterization of knowledge. Note that even if you didn't actively form the belief that the clock is currently working properly, it seems to be implicit in your reasoning, and the fact that it is false is surely relevant to the problem. After all, if you were asked at the time that you looked at the clock whether it is working properly, you would have said that it is, or you assume it is. Conversely, if you believed the clock wasn't working properly, you wouldn't be justified in forming a belief about the time based on what the clock says. In other words, the proposition that the clock is working properly right now meets the following conditions. It is a false proposition. You do not realize, though, that it is a false proposition. If you had realized that it is a false proposition, your justification for your belief that it is 11:56 would have been undercut or defeated. If we call propositions such as this defeaters, then we can say that to constitute knowledge, a belief must be true, it must be justified, you have good reason to believe it, and there must be no defeaters to the justification of that belief. Now, the defeaters may come later on as you realize it. Now, many epistemologists believe that this analysis is correct about what constitutes knowledge. So, In the example with the smallest particles, people assumed they had correct knowledge of atoms, but eventually a defeater was discovered, evidence of smaller particles, thus rendering the old knowledge false, and scientists realized their justification for their belief that electrons, neurons, and protons were the smallest particles had been undercut and therefore now unjustified. We often think we have a justified true belief, but only later realize we didn't. This goes back to my sermon on checking our blind spots. If we don't occasionally work to confirm our assumptions about a myriad of things, we think we have knowledge about what we may not realize how many defeaters there are for what we believe are justified true beliefs. So if we aren't constantly rechecking, we may not realize that a defeater exists and that we don't actually have the knowledge we think we have. This happens in science all the time, but also in our everyday lives when things challenge our stereotypes or we learn something about history that changes our understanding of the world. We'll talk more about this in a couple weeks when we talk about facts and opinions, because even facts don't always turn out to be true. So let's talk casual accounts of knowledge. Rather than modifying the justified true belief account of knowledge by adding a fourth condition as we've discussed, some epistemologists see the Gettier problem as reason to seek a substantially different narrative. We have noted that knowledge should not involve luck or chance, and that Gettier-type examples are those in which chance plays some role in the formation of a justified true belief. In typical instances of knowledge, the factors responsible for the justification of a belief are also responsible for its truth. For example, when the clock is working properly, your belief is both true and justified because it's based on the clock, which accurately displays the time. But one feature that all Gettier-type examples have in common is the lack of a clear connection between the truth and the justification of the belief in question. For example, your belief that the time is 11:56 is justified because it's based on the clock, but it's true because you happen to walk by at just the right moment. So we might insist that to constitute knowledge, a belief must be both true and justified, and its truth and justification must be connected somehow. There's no clear connection between the chance of you walking by the clock at the right time and the actual state of the clock. So this notion of a connection between the truth and justification of a belief turns out to be difficult to formulate precisely. But causal accounts of knowledge seek to capture the spirit of this proposal by more significantly altering the analysis of knowledge. I said casual earlier, it's causal. So such accounts maintain that in order for someone to know a proposition, there must be a causal connection between her belief in that proposition and the fact that the proposition encapsulates. This retains the truth condition since a proposition must be true in order for it to encapsulate a fact. However, it appears to be incompatible with fallibilism since it does not allow for the possibility that a belief be justified yet false. Strictly speaking, causal accounts of knowledge make no reference to justification, although we might attempt to reformulate fallibilism in somewhat modified terms in order to state this observation. While causal accounts of knowledge are no longer thought to be correct, they have engendered reliabilist theories of knowledge, which we'll talk about later. I covered this quickly, but of course a Google search will give you lots more information, but you don't really need to know causal accounts of knowledge. If you want to learn more, you can. Okay, so that was a lot to take in, and if you stuck with me through all of this, I'm impressed. Hopefully you paused a few times to let some concepts sink in about propositional knowledge and what actually constitutes knowledge, having a justified belief, good reason to believe it, not just because some wacko says it or because you want it to be true, and also it turning out to be true. But then you also can't have luck or chance involved in it for it to actually truly be knowledge. So next week, we're going to go further, and we're going to talk about the nature of justification, and then after that, the extent of human knowledge. How much can we actually know? And that's going to be really fun. So I hope you'll join me next week as we talk more about the nature of justification, how we are justified in believing something.